my privilege today to introduce Professor Jean-Yves Lacoste, giving his third in a series of lectures entitled From Theology to Theological Thinking. On Monday, Professor Lacoste spoke about theoria, vita philosophica, and Christian experience. Yesterday, we heard about philosophy, theology, and the academy. The title of today's lecture is Philosophy, Theology, and the Task of Theological Thinking. Now, yesterday's lecture may have left some of you feeling a little glum. Professor Lacoste had earlier suggested that Christians in antiquity were exemplary in their refusal to countenance a sharp division between philosophy and theology. Or to put it a bit more positively, that anti-Christians provide us with an understanding of philosophy that is always already open to considering topics now identified as theological. In the Middle Ages, however, things took a turn for the worse. Philosophy and theology began to emerge as differentiated fields of study, as discrete and separable modes of reflection. The establishment of the European university in the late 13th century was one cause of the problem, since the institution of distinct faculties carried in its wake a regrettable, if not calamitous, constriction of thought. Philosophy, it seems, suffered a worrying abbreviation. Scholars began to assume that certain topics were off limits. Philosophy organized itself without reference to Christian experience, without connection to a life lived liturgically before God. And theology, too, suffered. Christians struggled to think expansively. They found themselves constrained, cramped, and boxed in. In fact, for many in the university, the prospect of a genuinely exciting Christian theology, that is, an adventurous, cheerful, open-minded style of thought, the prospect of that fell from view. Scholars often did little more than revisit the tombs of those long departed, while dolefully muttering words from a lost age. Professor Lacoste mentioned that his second lecture involved a number of corpses. His point being, I suppose, that the dislocation of theological and philosophical thinking amounts to a deadening of thought, a loss of vitality, a drift towards lifelessness. As I listened yesterday, another image came to mind, that of an intimate friendship gone sour. Let me analogize this image, albeit with the proviso that, as with any analogy, it has its limits. In years gone by, two friends, and I'll forbear from calling them philosophy and theology, two friends were basically inseparable. The relationship they enjoyed was, in fact, so intimate that the friends were pretty much indistinguishable. Their thoughts were thoroughly intertwined. Their experiences were gloriously mixed, intimately entangled. Their shared broad horizon was pregnant with possibility and promise. But at some point, there was a parting of the ways. All of a sudden, the friends are no longer entangled, intertwined, and co-inherent. Instead, they've become individuals, holding each other at a distance. Or to put it a little bit differently, each person now looks upon herself and the other as a self-sufficient entity. Sometimes it seems that the estranged friends view each other with hostility, but more often than not, they simply regard each other with a sense of deep unease, because neither party can imagine what reconciliation might entail. To make matters still more troubling, neither individual quite knows who to blame for the rift. It wasn't a vicious argument. It wasn't an act of treachery or betrayal. Outsiders, in retrospect, can pinpoint one moment when things went wrong. But that type of insight doesn't seem to be available to the former friends. There's no obvious culprit here, at least to the friends. Mutual alienation and estrangement seem to be an accident of history, an inadvertence for which no one is responsible. Nevertheless, the situation in which the former friends find themselves is still disappointing, maybe even tragic. Both are now left to their own devices. Both find themselves diminished, reduced, and degraded. So it was in this rather gloomy condition of diminution, reduction, and degradation that Professor Lacoste left us yesterday. The legacy of the university particularly is such that philosophy and theology appear to be consigned to different realms. And practitioners in each field are saddled with restrictive presuppositions, false boundaries, artificial limits. The question we face today, then, is obvious. Does the modern period offer the prospect of anything better? Do any modern thinkers, and Professor Lacoste mentioned two names, that of Friedrich Schleiermacher and G.W.F. Hegel, do any modern thinkers provide the resources needed to overcome the differentiation of philosophy and theology? Granted that we cannot simply reinstate by force of will a patristic vita philosophica, is there some way to open philosophy to theological thinking? Or at least to open theology to philosophical thinking? These are in fact genuine questions. I do not know whether Professor Lacoste will alleviate my sense of glumness. I do not know how the story that he is telling will play out. Certainly I hope that tragedy will not win the day. In fact, and I borrow now from Professor Lacoste's experience and the Absolute, I hope that the logic of the eschaton liturgically interferes with our being towards death, and that we are graced by the wonder of a new beginning. But there really is no need for me to speculate at this juncture. All good things come to those who wait. And I know that we will benefit tremendously for a scholar who is renowned for his erudition, his creativity, his attention to detail, and his unflagging determination to reopen avenues for thought. It's with tremendous pleasure then that I turn the podium over to Professor Lacoste, who will deliver his final lecture entitled Philosophy, Theology, and the Task of Thinking.